Hey, Cross Park, welcome to your weekly leadership update. I have a few things for you today. First, updates with the why. Slow progress is the phrase. We were really hoping and expecting to have a little more to share than we do by now. We don't. Some of that is neutral. It's just kind of the way it is. It's a slow process. Some of it is related to changes within the why. You may have seen they sold a branch, their CEO retired. None of those things actually are going to hurt us or our partnership with Brace and Hemby in the long run, but they do tend to add just a bit to some of the slowness of the organization. We are still waiting on some of the financial pieces, which in many ways are the biggest question, so keep praying for that. We have made progress on conversation about specifics, so we have made some rough plans with the architect, and that the architect has given some possible sites on the property that look good to them, and we now are doing some further investigation of those sites to see which of them have pros and cons and might be the most suitable from an engineering standpoint. So that's progress. We will certainly have congregational meetings as we need to when we get closer, when we have some more significant momentum. Again, I'm very encouraged still. Nothing particularly discouraging happening. It's just slow, and that by itself can feel discouraging. Many of you, in fact, have asked me questions that we don't have all the answers to yet, but we are working on them. Things like, what if the Y decides in 5 years they don't want a church on their property, or they don't want our kind of church for whatever reason on their property? So there are sort of three angles to that. One is we're working on a contract that will help protect us. The second is that there's a sort of philosophical questions, and we are having some of those conversations now with the why and starting to work through what that means and what that looks like, and I've been encouraged there. And the third, of course, is trusting God's providence and His sovereignty, that if we get to the point where we have something that we can approve to possibly move forward in this relationship with Hemby, then we will further discuss those things and see if we believe God's leading us there, and to trust Him and to see what happens. So, not the most satisfying collection of answers, but oftentimes that's what we have. We have some partial answers, and we, of course, have the right kind of push to trust the Lord when it comes time to figure that out. So, slow progress continues to be the phrase with the why, and yet we're encouraged by that. It's not moving backwards. It hasn't hit any major potholes along the way. Well, I want us to talk for a minute about the book of Psalms. As we're in this playlist for the journey home, we're thinking big picture. I said last week that when I was leading my team through the Rockies, we often would navigate by landmarks, and we would get some elevation from our spot. If we couldn't see landmarks very well, we'd climb up high, and then we would compare the creek or the ridge or the valley to something on our maps. We're trying to make everything make sense. We're trying to fit the pieces together, and this is what we're always doing anytime we're trying to communicate or navigate. So, for example, if I just say to you, blue, you have no idea what I mean. I could be talking about my shirt. I could be talking about the sky and how it is or isn't blue, depending on how much Canadian smoke is in the way. I could be talking about how I feel or about how someone else feels. If I just say blue, you don't know. What does your brain do, though? Your brain immediately starts looking for a context, for additional possibilities that would make sense of the word blue, that would fill in the gaps. So we're always doing this. When we read the Bible, we're always taking whatever we read and innately comparing it to other contexts. So if we read a verse, we're thinking about the words. Do we know what the words mean? Do we understand the grammar, how the words relate to each other, what parts each word play? In the Psalms, we're thinking about imagery. Do we understand what the metaphor might be? We're thinking about poetry. Do we understand how Hebrew poetry might work, how the lines tend to parallel each other and advance the thought? Then beyond that, of course, we're taking a verse and we're trying to set it in a paragraph or in a chapter. We're trying to set those chapters into books, right? We're always thinking about these sort of ever expanding and ever cascading contexts. There's always a bigger context in one sense. We're thinking about the whole Old Testament, the whole New Testament. Where does our book fit? We're thinking about the progress of God's work in history. How does this book, this verse, this chapter relate to Jesus? Is it before or after him? How does it anticipate him? How does it show fulfillment? How does it make promises? Things like that. And then, of course, we're setting it in the context of the whole Bible and all of our theology and everything God has revealed. And really, in this sense, the ultimate context for all of our thinking, not just about the Bible, but all of our thinking, the ultimate context is God himself. That everything is set in the context of God, and he makes sense of all things for us. He explains and contains all truth. All truth is God's truth. Every fact of the universe points, if properly understood, to the triune God who has revealed himself in nature and in Jesus and in his word through the church. So we're always trying to set everything in context. So let's think about some of the broader contexts of the Psalms. Especially there are arrangements and relationships for how the different Psalms relate to one another. The most obvious one is if you read through the book of Psalms, you'll notice that the book of Psalms has 5 books in it, books 1 through 5. And these 5 books in some ways parallel the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. There's also relationships between the different Psalms. Psalms play different roles. So we know that 1 and 2 are kind of the prologue, and 146 through 150 are kind of the epilogue, and they really bookend the Psalms. If you think about Psalms 1 and 2, they work together to give you an introduction to the whole book of Psalms. Psalm 1 tells you that you're wanting to find blessedness, happiness, joy. We all want to live a life of happiness and holiness. And then Psalm 2 tells us how we get that, by following the God who is King. So we're made for holiness and happiness, and the way we get there, the way we get it, is by following the God who reigns. And Psalm 2 tells us that we're either going to go one of 2 ways. Psalm 1 has sort of the 2 ways, right? And Psalm 2 has 2 ways. You'll either pursue a life of selfishness and reject God, or you'll bow properly to his kingship and find the happiness you're looking for. So that's an example of how Psalms 1 and 2 set up the rest of the text. There's also an overall movement in the Psalms. Scholars have argued, and I think they're right, that there's a general move from lament to praise, or from suffering to glory. And so more of the lament Psalms are earlier in the text, and by the end you're getting lots and lots of praise. There's also the arrangement of Psalms within the 5 books of the Psalter also matter. And you notice that particularly at the beginning and the ends of the 5 books, there is an arrangement of certain Psalms. There's an arrangement particularly of Davidic Psalms that remind you that the Psalms are about the king, about how God is king and God reigns through the human king, and that God has made promises to and through the house of David. And so you're always going to see some connection for how these relate to each other. So let's think about this for a minute. Book 1 is particularly about David, promises made to David, and that they are in the process of being fulfilled. Book 2, you see a little bit of Solomonic promise. You see some transition, sort of historically. You're sort of moving, thinking David and his offspring now. You see that the king is the truly happy person, and so are those who live under the king and let him reign over them. In book 3, you're getting some negativity about the kingship of David and his family until you get to Psalm 89, the end of book 3. It's very negative. It's asking, have the promises of God failed? In fact, book 3 ends with Psalm 89 asking a bunch of promises about what in the world's going on. And then book 4 responds. Book 4, each psalm in book 4 responds to at least one, usually more than one, of the questions raised at the end of book 3 in Psalm 89. And so book 4, which we preached through last couple summers, we saw the sense of God's kingship. God's clearly the king. He clearly is leading his people. You may not have a king of David over you at the moment, but you have God as king, and that was always the goal of the Davidic kingship anyways. It's pushing you forward to trust God and to the fulfillment of his kingdom. And finally, book 5 continues this idea that there will be a Davidic king. There is a king coming, and that the divine messianic king will in fact live out the promises made to David and his line. Okay, within the Psalms in smaller ways, there are little collections. There are Psalms that are related to one another. So a classic example is Psalms 15 through 24. and it's kind of arranged in a stair-step way where 15 and 24 are similar, 16 and 23 are similar, 17 and 22, 18 and 21, and then 19 and 20 are in the middle. They're the focus of this collection of Psalms. So there are all these little books within the book of Psalms. There are these collections, playlists, if you will, of carefully arranged material. Obviously, today we are talking about a playlist for the journey home, and they are all tied together by themes, but also by the little superscription, the little title. Each one says a song of ascents. I was just reading today an article about how there are tight themes between 135, 136, and 137. And once you see that there's a connection between those, right, once you know there's more context, then you read those Psalms more profitably. So we may not always know why any two particular Psalms are put next to each other, but we can ask questions about them. Oftentimes it's helpful to not just think about what's next to each other, but how do Psalms share the same genres? So for example, if you know the basic stuff that's in a lament psalm, well then you can recognize another psalm and see if it is a lament psalm or not. Also, if there is a lament psalm, it has some of the traditional elements of lament, and yet it's missing or has left out certain elements. That's an interpretive question. Why are those elements left out here? What is the psalmist trying to teach us? And then finally, and we're starting to see this now in our sermon series, that there are themes, right? Concepts or even linguistic words that are connected to each other. So in Psalm 120, he's searching for peace, and in 122, he's found it. In 121 and 123, he's lifting up his eyes. In 120, he's asking for deliverance from deceitful mouths, deceitful tongues. And you see some of that same language showing up in 124 this week. Maker of heaven and earth is a phrase that's already shown up several times and will continue to in our series. And then finally, as I've been studying 124 this week in preparation for our sermon, I've seen how 124 is anticipating certain themes of 125. The whole goal here is to help you make the most of your time in the Word, of your Bible reading. We believe God has communicated his greatest truths to us in a way we can understand here in the Bible. And so we want you to be able to read it as profitably as possible, and thinking about these contexts and even particularly about some of these psalm connections will help you to do that. So as you read through our playlist, our sermon series, I encourage you to read them in a chunk. They're short psalms. You could easily read our chunk pretty quickly, and to think through what connections there might be. What connections have I missed? What connections have you not noticed before? And how can those fill out what God is wanting to teach you? So we said Psalm 124 is this week's psalm. As you should know by now, we are on our summer schedule, which means no Sunday school. We are having our service at 9:30 to beat the heat. So we are having worship at 9:30 this Sunday, Psalm 124. And as I close, let me read to you how I have rewritten Psalm 124 as a psalm for us, as a poem that will help us think even particularly about how Jesus fulfills it. Psalm 124. Without help, we'd have died. God showed up on our side. They had us dead to rights, well centered in their sights. He took our cause in hand, allowing us to stand against their flowing rage, our worries to assuage. God did not look away, nor let us fall as prey. We popped the latch with glee, traps busted, now we're free. God showed up on our side. See him, the crucified. Well, Cross Park, I hope that helps get you thinking. Please join us at 9:30 Sunday, and we will talk together about Psalm 124. See you then.